The morning alarm echoed through Station Helios 7 like the scream of a wounded animal. And cadets from 12 different star systems stumbled out of their sleeping quarters with tired eyes and heavy limbs. Because nobody ever truly got used to waking up at such an early hour. No matter what planet they came from, or how many years they had trained for this moment. Yoon Seo-yeon walked at the back of the crowd. Her footsteps silent on the metal floor, her dark eyes watching everything and everyone around her. And she said nothing as she moved because she almost never said anything at all. And the other cadets had learned to ignore her presence the way one ignores a shadow on the wall. The training hall was enormous, with ceilings that stretched up toward artificial skylights that mimicked the warmth of a yellow sun. And holographic displays floated in the air showing combat statistics and ranking boards. And at the front of the room stood Instructor Vreth, a Cathari warrior with 4 muscular arms and skin the color of burnt copper. "Listen carefully," Vreth announced, his voice rumbling like distant thunder, "because I will not repeat myself. And those who fail to understand will suffer the consequences in the simulation chamber." The cadets straightened their spines and focused their attention, because everyone knew that Instructor Vreth had fought in 3 interstellar wars and had killed more enemies than most soldiers would ever see in a lifetime. And his approval meant everything to those who dreamed of becoming elite warriors. "The combat simulation final begins tomorrow," Vreth continued, his forearms folded across his massive chest. "And you will face scenarios that will test every skill you have learned. And some skills you never knew you needed. And those who cannot adapt will fail. And failure means academic probation." A nervous murmur rippled through the assembled cadets. And Seo-yeon remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Her breathing steady and calm. Standing near the front of the group was Dren, a Veloci with pale blue skin and silver eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. And he was considered one of the most talented cadets in the academy because his species possessed powerful telepathic abilities that allowed them to sense enemy positions and read intentions. Before attacks could land, Dren glanced back at Seo-yeon with a smirk on his thin lips, and he reached out with his mind to touch hers, expecting to find the usual jumble of thoughts and emotions that filled most beings. But instead, he found only static, like the empty hiss of a broken communication channel. "Nothing," he whispered to his squad mates. A Torvian named Mikos and 2 smaller aliens called Yeth and Prawl. "Her mind is completely empty, like there is nobody home inside that skull of hers," Mikos laughed, his massive shoulders shaking with amusement, because he stood nearly 8 feet tall and weighed more than 3 humans combined. And he had never lost a sparring match in his entire time at the academy. And the idea of the silent human girl being assigned to their squad seemed like a joke to him. Why did they even let her into the program? Yeth asked, her compound eyes blinking with confusion. "She never speaks, she never participates in discussions. And her combat scores are barely above average. I heard she was admitted through some kind of observation program," Prawl added, his voice low and secretive. "But nobody knows what that means or why the Federation would waste resources on someone so ordinary." Seo-yeon heard every word they said, because her hearing was sharper than they realized, and she felt their mockery settle against her skin like drops of cold rain. But she did not react, because reactions attracted attention, and attention was something she had learned to avoid many years ago. The day continued with standard training exercises, and the cadets moved through obstacle courses and tactical simulations. And Seo-yeon completed each task with quiet efficiency, never excelling enough to draw notice, but never failing enough to warrant concern. Then came the sparring session, and Instructor Vreth called out the pairings with his booming voice. And when he announced that Seo-yeon would face Mikos, The entire training hall fell silent for a moment before erupting into whispered conversations and barely hidden laughter. "This will not take long," Mekos declared, cracking his enormous knuckles as he stepped onto the sparring mat. "I will try not to break anything important." Seo Yeon walked onto the mat without a word, her small frame looking almost childlike compared to the towering Torvian, and she settled into a stance that nobody recognized. Her weight balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet. The match began, and Mekos charged forward with the confidence of someone who had never experienced defeat, his fist swinging towards Seo Yeon like a falling meteor, and she moved, sliding beneath his arm with fluid grace. And the crowd gasped because nobody had expected her to dodge the first strike of Mekos pressed his attack, throwing punch after punch, kick after kick, and Seo Yeon avoided each one with movements that seemed almost lazy, her body bending and twisting like water flowing around stones in a stream, but she could not avoid forever. And eventually, one of his strikes connected, sending her tumbling across the mat. And Mekos stood over her with triumph in his eyes. Match concluded, the combat AI announced. Victor, Cadet Mekos. Time, 2 minutes and 14 seconds. The crowd cheered for Mekos. And nobody noticed the secondary data that scrolled across Instructor Vreth's personal display. A small notation that read, Subject Yun exceeded predicted survival duration by 47 seconds. Combat analysis indicates deliberate performance limitation. Vreth narrowed his eyes and studied the human girl as she rose from the mat without complaint, without anger, without any visible emotion at all. And he recognized something in her stillness that troubled him deeply later that evening. The simulation pods were activated for calibration, and cadets took turns entering the massive machines to allow the systems to record their biometric data and establish baseline parameters for the upcoming test. When Seo Yeon entered her pod, the screens around her flickered with strange light, and an error message appeared that made the monitoring technician frown with confusion. Warning: subject parameters exceed standard combat metrics. Override recommended. Anomaly detected in stress response baseline. Subject displays conditioning patterns consistent with extreme survival scenarios. That cannot be right, the technician muttered, tapping buttons on his console. She's just a quiet girl with average scores. The system must be malfunctioning. He deleted the warning and logged it as a calibration error, because he had seen 100 cadets pass through these pods, and none of them had ever triggered such a strange response. And he assumed the machine was simply having a bad day inside the pod. Zhao Yian sat with her eyes closed, her breathing slow and measured. And somewhere deep in her memory, a child crawled through burning wreckage while voices screamed in the darkness. And a phrase repeated itself like a prayer that had kept her alive when nothing else could keep moving. The voice whispered, "Never stop moving." And Seo Yan opened her eyes and stepped out of the pod without saying a word to anyone. Tomorrow, the simulation would begin. And nobody except perhaps Instructor Vreth understood what that would truly mean, because nobody knew what lived behind the silence that Yoon Seo Yan wore like armor. And nobody had any idea how badly they had underestimated the quiet human girl who walked among them like a ghost. The simulation chamber hummed with energy as 12 cadets walked toward their assigned pods, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with nervous anticipation, because everyone knew that this test would determine their futures at the Academy. Seo Yeon followed her squad through the gleaming corridor, her footsteps making no sound against the polished floor. And ahead of her, Dren was already giving orders with the confidence of someone who believed leadership was his birthright. "The scenario is simple," Dren announced, his silver eyes bright with excitement. "We enter an abandoned space station, eliminate hostile AI drones, and rescue a civilian hologram within 30 minutes. Mikos nodded with eager enthusiasm, his massive hands already forming fists in anticipation of combat. And Yeth and Prawl checked their simulated weapons one final time. "What about the human?" Prawl asked, gesturing toward So-Yoon with a dismissive wave of his appendagedron, barely glanced in her direction before responding. "She stays at the rear as support. And by support, I mean she should try not to get in our way or slow us down." So-Yoon said nothing, because she never said anything. And the others took her silence as acceptance of her role as the weakest member of their squad. The pods opened with a soft hiss of pressurized air, and one by one the cadets climbed inside and sealed themselves within the machines that would transport their minds into the digital battlefield neural links activated, with a tingling sensation that spread from the base of the skull throughout the entire body. And suddenly, So-Yoon was no longer sitting in a pod, but standing in a dark corridor inside a derelict space station. The smell of rust and decay filling her nostrils, despite knowing that none of it was real. "Squad 7. Your simulation has begun," the AI announced through their communication implants. "Objective markers have been placed on your displays. Good luck." Dren immediately took point, his telepathic senses reaching outward to detect enemy positions. And Mikos fell into position behind him with Yeth and Prawl covering the flanks, and So-Yoon walked at the very back, watching everything with those dark, quiet eyes. The first 15 minutes passed smoothly, and the squad moved through the station with practiced efficiency, clearing rooms and eliminating drones with coordinated precision. Dren's telepathy proved invaluable, allowing him to sense enemies before they appeared. And Mikos demonstrated his overwhelming strength by tearing through mechanical opponents like they were made of paper. And even Yeth and Prawl contributed with well-placed shots and tactical support. So-Yoon remained silent throughout, doing exactly what she had been told, staying out of the way and offering no input as her squadmates congratulated themselves on their excellent performance. "This is almost too easy," Mikos laughed, crushing a drone's head beneath his foot. "I expected more of a challenge from the final examination." The words had barely left his mouth when everything changed. Warning lights flashed red throughout the station, and an alarm began screaming with a sound that hurt their ears. And the I-voice returned with a message that made every cadet freeze in place. Difficulty escalation initiated. Scenario parameters updating. Threat level. Extinction class. What is happening? Yeth shrieked, her compound eyes wide with terror. Dren's telepathy suddenly detected dozens of new signatures appearing all around them. Enemy contacts multiplying faster than he could count. And his confident expression crumbled into something that looked very much like fear. "This is wrong," he stammered. "This level of difficulty should not be possible in a training simulation." Outside the simulation, Instructor Vreth watched his monitoring screens with growing alarm, his four hands dancing across the control panels as he tried to access the override systems. "Abort the simulation," he commanded the technicians. "Pull them out now." "We cannot," a technician responded, his voice shaking. "The system is not responding to our commands. Someone has locked us out." Vreth slammed his fist against the console with enough force to crack the surface, and he watched helplessly as his cadets faced a nightmare that no training scenario should ever contain inside the simulation. Chaos Arab Ted Mikos charged toward a group of drones with his usual confidence, but there were too many, and concentrated fire from multiple angles brought him down before he could reach them. His simulated body dissolving into digital fragments, Mikos is eliminated, the AI announced with cold indifference. Yeth and Prawl retreated into a corner, trying to establish a defensive position. But the drones surrounded them from all directions, and within seconds, they too were gone, their screams echoing through the communication link before cutting off abruptly. 4 squad members eliminated. The AI continued, 6 cadets remaining across all squads. Dren stood frozen in the middle of the corridor, his mind overwhelmed by the telepathic noise of so many hostile presences. And he could not think clearly enough to form a plan, because nothing in his training had prepared him for this level of threat. Drones approached from both ends of the hallway, their weapons charging with deadly light. And Dren knew that he was about to die in this simulation, and even though death here was not real, the fear certainly was. Then he heard something that made him question everything he thought he knew. "Get behind me," a voice said, soft but clear and absolutely calm. Now, Dren spun around and saw Seiyan standing in the middle of the corridor, the quiet human girl who had never spoken more than single words. And she was looking at him with eyes that held no fear at all, only a terrible focused intensity that seemed to belong to someone much older and much more dangerous. "What are you doing?" Dren demanded, his voice cracking with panic. Seiyan did not repeat herself, because she had learned long ago that words were precious things that should never be wasted, and instead she simply moved, placing herself between Dren and the approaching drones. The machines registered her as a target and adjusted their aim, and Dren watched with disbelief as the silent girl who everyone had dismissed as worthless settled into that strange stance he had seen during her sparring match with Mikos, simulation refusing to respond to external commands. The AI announced to whoever might be listening. Difficulty escalation continuing. All safety protocols offline. Somewhere outside, emergency alarms began to wail as Instructor Vreth called for backup. But inside the digital nightmare, there was only Seiyan standing between Dren and death. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps he had made a terrible mistake in underestimating the human who carried silence like a shield. The first drone fired, and Seiyan moved, and Dren realized that everything he thought he knew about combat was about to be rewritten by a girl who had never once asked for anyone to notice her at all. The drone fired and Seiyan was already moving before the light left the barrel, her body twisting sideways with a grace that seemed almost inhuman. And the energy bolt passed so close to her cheek that Dren could see the heat distortion in the air. She did not pause to celebrate her survival, because celebration was a luxury that belonged to people who had never learned what real danger felt like. And instead, she launched herself toward the nearest drone with movements that turned the corridor into a blur of motion. Her first strike crushed the machine's optical sensors with her bare palm. And before it could adjust, she had already grabbed its weapon arm and redirected its fire toward its companions. And 3 more drones collapsed in a shower of sparks and shattered metal. Dren pressed himself against the wall and watched with his mouth hanging open, because this was not the quiet girl who sat at the back of every class. This was something else entirely. Something that moved like violence given human form. Seiyan ripped a metal panel from the wall and used it as both shield and weapon, blocking incoming fire while closing the distance to her enemies. And when she reached them, she did not fight the way the Academy taught. She did not follow forms or techniques from any manual that Dren had ever studied. She fought like survival itself. Brutal and efficient and absolutely merciless, 7 drones fell in 11 seconds. And then she was grabbing a fallen weapon and turning it against the machines that poured through the doorway at the far end of the corridor. And her aim was perfect, every shot finding its target without hesitation. Dren tried once more to reach her mind with his telepathy, pushing harder than he had ever pushed before. And this time, he broke through the static that had always blocked him. What he found made his blood turn to ice. Her mind was not empty at all. It was surrounded by walls, massive constructions of mental discipline built through years of repetition and pain. And behind those walls, he glimpsed fragments that he wished he had never seen. Fire everywhere. Screaming voices, a child crawling through wreckage that used to be her home. Bodies lying in positions that no living person could achieve. The smell of smoke and worse things filling tiny lungs, Dren saw a little girl hiding in a collapsed building while raiders searched for survivors, holding her breath until her vision darkened, pressing her hands against her mouth to stop herself from crying out when she heard them. Killing someone nearby. Saw 47 Days of Hell. A child alone in the ruins of a colony called Meridian 6. Drinking water from broken pipes and eating whatever she could find. Moving only at night because the raiders patrolled during the day. Learning that silence meant survival and sound meant death. And through all of it, a single phrase repeated like a heartbeat. Keep moving, never stop. Keep moving. Never stop. Dren pulled his mind away from hers with a gasp that sounded like a man surfacing from deep water. And he stared at So Yin with new understanding in his silver eyes. She was not a cadet. Not really. She was a survivor of something so terrible that the Academy had placed her in an observation program just to study how she had managed to stay alive when everyone else had died. The simulation responded to her combat performance by escalating further, because that was what it had been designed to do. And larger enemies began to spawn at the far end of the corridor. Boss-class units with heavier armor and more devastating weapons. Xion did not hesitate. But even she could not fight forever against an enemy that would never stop coming. And she grabbed Drem by the arm and pulled him toward a ventilation shaft that she had somehow noticed despite the chaos of combat. Inside, she commanded. And her voice was steady despite the exertion. Now, Dren scrambled into the shaft without argument, his pride completely forgotten in the face of what he had just witnessed, and Seo Yan followed close behind, sealing the entrance with a piece of debris that would buy them only minutes at most. In the darkness of the ventilation system, they could hear the drones searching for them, metal feet clanging against the corridor floor, weapons charging and discharging as the machines fired at shadows. I did not know, Dren whispered. I tried to read your mind before and found nothing. I thought you were empty, but you were hiding. You were always hiding. Seo Yeon turned to look at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. And she nodded once, a small acknowledgement of his words. Why do you never speak? Dren asked, his voice barely audible. Why do you hide what you can do? For a long moment she did not answer, and Dren thought perhaps she would return to her silence. But then she spoke in soft sentences that carried the weight of years. Words attract attention. She explained, when I was young, after the attack, I learned that silence kept me alive. The raiders listened for sounds. Crying, footsteps, breathing too loud. If they heard you, they found you. If they found you, they killed you. She paused and checked the shaft ahead, making sure no drones had found a way inside by the time rescue came. I had forgotten how to want conversation. Speaking felt dangerous, unnecessary, a waste of energy that I needed for survival. Dren felt shame burning in his chest, because he had mocked her for the very thing that had kept her alive through an ordeal he could not even imagine. And your combat skills? He pressed. Why hide those? Seo Yin's expression did not change as she answered. Strength attracts challengers when people know what you can do. They either fear you or want to test you. I am tired of fighting. I do not want attention. I do not want tests. I want to be left alone. The simulation shuddered around them, and new alerts flashed across their displays. Warning of increased enemy activity throughout the station. The system is adaptive, CEO Yan continued, her voice taking on a tactical edge. It learns from our responses and increases difficulty based on threat assessment. I have been showing it too much. It will not stop now until it wins or we do. How do we survive? Dren asked, and for the first time in his life, he was genuinely asking someone else for guidance. Trusting someone else to know better than him. Seo Yan pointed down the shaft toward a distant junction. There is a manual override terminal in the central control room. If we reach it, we can shut down the simulation from inside. But the system has already classified me as a primary threat. Meaning what? Meaning if I approach that terminal directly, it will send everything to stop me. She met his eyes with that terrible calm intensity. But it still considers you a secondary target. A distraction to be dealt with after the main threat is eliminated. Dren understood what she was proposing, and fear gripped his heart. You want to use yourself as bait. I want you to reach that terminal while the simulation focuses its resources on killing me, she corrected. Can you do it? Outside the simulation, Instructor Vreth finally managed to contact Federation Emergency Response, and teams were cutting through the door to the pod room with plasma torches. But the estimated time of arrival was still 4 minutes away. 4 minutes was an eternity in combat. And Vreth watched his screens with mounting horror as the simulation continued to escalate beyond any parameters that should have been possible. Hold on, he whispered to the cadets he could not reach. Please hold on. Inside the ventilation shaft, Dren looked at Seo Yan and saw something he had never expected to find in the quiet girl he had dismissed as worthless. He saw someone willing to sacrifice herself for a person who had treated her with nothing but contempt. I can do it, he said finally, his voice firmer than he felt. I can reach the terminal. Seo Yan nodded once and began crawling toward the exit. And somewhere in her mind, the old mantra repeated itself. The words that had carried her through 47 days of hell and would carry her through whatever came next. Keep moving, it whispered. Never stop moving. The ventilation shaft split into 2 directions at a junction marked by flickering emergency lights. And Seo Yan stopped to study the layout displayed on her neural interface, mapping the fastest routes to both the central control room and the terminal that Dren needed to reach. The override console is 300 meters east, she said quietly, pointing down the left passage. You will encounter minimal resistance if you move quickly and stay close to the walls where the sensor coverage is weakest. Dren memorized the route she described, his silver eyes reflecting the dim glow of her display. And he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of true understanding. What about you? He asked. Though he already knew the answer, Seo Yan gestured toward the right passage. The central chamber is that direction. When I engage the primary defense units, the system will redirect approximately 80% of its resources to eliminating me. That should give you enough time. Should, Dren repeated. Tasting the uncertainty in that single word, nothing is guaranteed, Seo Yan acknowledged. But I survived 47 days in the ruins of my colony with no weapons, no food, and no hope of rescue. This simulation is difficult. But difficulty is not the same as impossible. Dren wanted to argue, wanted to insist that there must be another way. But he looked into her eyes and saw something that silenced his protests. She was not being reckless or heroic. She was simply calculating odds, the way she had learned to calculate odds as a child, measuring risk against survival with the cold precision of someone who had died countless times before. You actually believe you can win, he realized. Not hope, not faith, you actually believe it. Seo Yan shrugged with one shoulder, a tiny gesture that somehow conveyed more than any grand declaration could have. Belief is irrelevant. Action is what matters. I will move and fight until I cannot move or fight anymore. The system is powerful, but it follows patterns. Patterns can be exploited. Patterns can be broken. She checked the improvised blade she had fashioned from a piece of drone plating, testing its edge against her thumb and nodding with satisfaction at the thin line of simulated blood that appeared. When you reach the terminal, she continued, you will need to input a manual override code. The system will try to protect itself by locking you out, but there is always a delay between lockout attempts. You must be faster than the delay. I have never done manual coding under combat conditions, Dren admitted, his voice small with shame. Then you will learn, Seo Yeon replied. And there was no judgment in her tone, only simple acceptance of the situation. We all learn when we have no other choice. That is what survival means. She turned to leave. But Dren caught her arm, and she stopped without pulling away. Waiting for whatever he needed to say, "I am sorry," he told her, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "For everything, for mocking your silence, for calling you empty, for treating you like you were nothing. I was wrong. I was so completely wrong." Seo Yeon studied his face for a moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps acceptance of his apology. "You did not know," she said simply. "People fear what they do not understand, and they mock what they fear. It is human nature. It is the nature of all thinking beings. But I should have tried to understand instead of should have his past," she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "What matters now is what you do next. Reach the terminal, shut down the simulation. Save the others who are still trapped in this nightmare." Dren released her arm and nodded, his jaw tight with determination that he had never felt before. "I will not fail. I promise you that." "Do not promise," Seo Yeon said as she turned toward the right passage. "Promises are words. Words mean nothing without action. Just do it." And then she was gone, crawling through the ventilation shaft toward certain combat, leaving Dren alone with his fear and his newfound respect and the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He watched her disappear around a corner, and for a moment he could still feel the residual echo of her mind through his telepathic senses. That terrible calm focus, that absolute refusal to surrender. That mantra repeating endlessly in the depths of her consciousness, "Keep moving. Never stop." Dren took a deep breath and began his own journey toward the override terminal, forcing his shaking hands to steady themselves, reminding himself that a girl half his size was about to face an army of machines to give him this chance outside the simulation. Instructor Vreth watched the deployment of drones on his monitoring screens, and his four hands gripped the edge of his console until the metal creaked in protest. The system had generated a nightmare scenario in the central chamber. 30 combat drones with varying armaments. 2 boss-class units designed to counter adaptive threats. Environmental hazards including unstable flooring and explosive containers scattered throughout the space. She is heading directly toward them, one of the technicians reported with disbelief. She is actually walking into the most heavily defended area of the entire simulation. Vreth studied Seo Yin's vital signs on his display. Her heart rate steady, her stress hormones barely elevated. A neural activity showing none of the panic that would be expected from someone facing such overwhelming odds. "She is not fighting to survive," he murmured, finally understanding what he was seeing. She is fighting to protect him. She is creating a distraction so the Veloci boy can reach the override. But the system has classified her as a maximum threat. Another technician objected. "It will send everything to stop her. She cannot possibly." "She survived Meridian 6, Vreth interrupted, his voice heavy with something that might have been awe. 47 days alone in the ruins while raiders hunted survivors. She was 9 years old. And she outlasted trained soldiers, experienced fighters, adults with weapons and resources that she never had." He turned to face his staff, and his expression was grim. "We do not know what she can or cannot do. And frankly, neither does she, because she has never truly tested her limits. She has spent her entire life hiding her capabilities, avoiding attention, refusing to show what she learned in those 47 days of hell." The plasma torches cutting through the pod room door sputtered and flared. Emergency response teams working as fast as possible. But the metal was thick, and time was running out. How long until they breach? Vreth demanded. 3 minutes. came the reply. Vreth looked back at his screens, watching the lone human figure approach the central chamber, and he clenched all four of his fists. "Hold on," he whispered again. Though he knew she could not hear him, "Show them what you are made of." Inside the simulation, Seo Yian dropped from the ventilation shaft and landed softly on the floor of the central chamber, and the machines immediately registered her presence. Dozens of optical sensors swiveling to track her movement. "Anomaly detected," the system announced, its artificial voice echoing through the massive space. "Maximum response authorized." Seo Yan straightened her spine and looked at the army of drones arranged before her, their weapons charging with deadly light. Their programming focused entirely on eliminating the threat. She thought of Dren crawling through the ventilation system, thought of the other cadets who were still trapped in pods waiting to be freed, thought of a little girl who had once hidden in the darkness and refused to die. Then she settled into her stance and spoke two words that the system could not possibly understand. "Come try." The drones opened fire in unison, and Seo Yan was already moving, her body flowing through the storm of energy bolts like water, finding the path of least resistance. And she had spent years learning to read patterns, to anticipate attacks before they came, to exist in the spaces between danger where survival was possible. She grabbed a fallen metal beam and used it to deflect incoming fire, the impacts jarring her arms but not stopping her forward momentum. And she closed the distance to the nearest cluster of drones with movements that seemed to defy physics. Itself, her first strike took out a drone's legs, dropping it to the ground, where she finished it with a brutal stomp. And she was already spinning to meet the next attacker before the first one had stopped sparking. The combat became a dance, if dance could be performed in hell, and Seo Yan moved through the chamber, destroying machines with whatever she could find. Broken pipes, torn plating, the weapons of fallen enemies. Anything that could serve her purpose somewhere in the ventilation system. Dren crawled as fast as his body would allow, his heart pounding so hard that he could feel it in his throat. And through the residual telepathic connection, he could sense flashes of Seo Yan's battle. The impacts, the near misses, the pain of wounds that the simulation made feel entirely real. She was taking damage. Energy bolts grazing her arms and legs, simulated blood spreading across her uniform. But she refused to slow down, refused to retreat, refused to give the system any advantage. Keep moving. The mantra pounded through her mind. Never stop. Keep moving. Dren reached the junction where the terminal waited. A small room separated from the main corridors by a single door that opened at his approach. And inside, he found a console covered with holographic displays and input panels that looked far more complex than anything he had practiced with. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "You can do this. She's dying out there to give you this chance. You cannot fail." His fingers touched the interface, and immediately warnings flashed across the screen. The system detecting his attempt to access override functions and fighting back with layers of security that seemed designed to confuse and overwhelm. Back in the central chamber, the boss-class units had joined the battle. Massive constructions of metal and weapons that towered over Seo Yan like mechanical giants. And she was forced to change her tactics, no longer pressing attacks but instead focusing on survival. Dodging and weaving through a maze of destruction, one of the giants swung a limb that would have crushed her skull, and she dropped flat to avoid it, rolling sideways, just as the floor where she had been standing erupted from a secondary attack. "Threat level critical," the system announced, deploying final countermeasures. More drones spawned at the edges of the chamber, and Seo Yan felt her strength beginning to fade. Her body pushed beyond limits that even her conditioning could sustain. But she did not stop, because stopping meant death. And death meant failing Dren, and failure was not acceptable at the terminal. Dren's hands flew across the interface, entering commands that he barely understood. Relying on instinct and desperation to guide him through layers of digital defense, the system locked him out once, twice, 3 times, but each lockout had a delay just as Seo Yan had said. And in those precious seconds between attempts, he managed to advance further toward the override. Almost there, he breathed. Sweat dripping down his face. Almost there. Outside the simulation, the emergency response teams finally breached the pod room door, and Instructor Vreth rushed forward to the control stations, his 4 hands working multiple systems simultaneously as he tried to assist the shutdown process from his end. "We need 30 more seconds," a technician shouted. "The system is resisting, but we are getting through." 30 seconds felt like an eternity as Vreth watched Seo Yin's vital signs spike with exertion and pain inside the central chamber. Seo Yan was surrounded, drones closing in from all sides, while the 2 boss units positioned themselves to deliver killing blows. And she stood in the center of the chaos with blood running down her face and her improvised weapons broken at her feet. She had nothing left. No weapons, no strength, no clever tactics. Just her body and her will and the refusal to surrender that had kept her alive since she was a child crawling through the ashes of her home. Anomaly will be eliminated, the system declared. Initiating termination sequence. Then her display flickered, and a new message appeared: override initiated. System shutdown in progress. Dren had done it. He had reached through the security and triggered the shutdown. And Seo Yan felt something that might have been relief wash through her exhausted body, but the shutdown was not instant. And the drones were still active during the wind-down period, their programming driving them to complete their final mission. And one of the boss units turned away from Seo Yan toward the terminal room where Dren was still standing. It was going to kill him. She realized. It was going to reach him before the shutdown finished, and it was going to kill him for daring to stop the simulation. Seo Yan should have stayed where she was, should have let the countdown complete, and trusted that Dren would survive the assault. Because she was injured and exhausted, and moving any further would risk her own elimination. Instead, she ran. She sprinted across the chamber faster than she had ever moved, pushing her simulated body past every limit it had. And she intercepted the boss unit just as it raised its weapon to fire at Dren through the open doorway. The impact of her body against the machine did almost nothing to stop its momentum, but it changed the angle of its attack just enough. And the energy blast that should have killed Dren instead scorched the wall beside him. The boss unit turned its attention back to her, and she had no defense, no weapon, no way to avoid what came next. The strike hit her directly, and her world exploded into pain and light and darkness. Then, silent Seo Yan opened her eyes in the medical ward 3 days later. And the first thing she saw was Instructor Vreth standing beside her bed with an expression she could not read. "You are awake," he observed, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "The doctors were not certain when you would regain consciousness." She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. And Vreth handed her a cup of water that she drank slowly, carefully, the way she had learned to drink when water was scarce and survival depended on making every drop count. "The investigation is complete," Vreth continued. "Someone inserted malicious code into the simulation. Sabotage from an anti-human faction within the Federation. They wanted to prove that humans did not belong in combat programs." Seo Yan said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Instead, they proved the opposite. Vreth allowed himself a small smile. "Your performance saved 7 lives, including Dren and 5 other cadets who would have been killed if the simulation had continued unchecked." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded almost like pride. "The Academy has reviewed your status. You are no longer an observation subject. You are being offered full cadet enrollment with an instructor track recommendation." Seo Yan considered this for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "No?" Vreth raised one eyebrow. "I will accept enrollment," she said softly, "but not the instructor position." "Why not?" She met his eyes with that quiet intensity that had become her defining characteristic. "I do not want to teach people how to fight. I want to teach them when to stop." Reth studied her for a long moment, then nodded with understanding. That may be the wiser lesson. After he left, another visitor appeared in the doorway, and Seo Yeon looked up to see Dren standing there with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and shame, walked to her bedside and sat down without asking permission. And for a while neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence communicated more than words ever could. "You saved my life," he finally said. "You took that hit for me when you could have just let the shutdown finish." Seo Yeon shrugged with one shoulder, that same tiny gesture she had made in the ventilation shaft. "You did not freeze at the terminal. You kept moving. You did not stop even when you were afraid." Dren recognized the weight of those words, understood that from her perspective there was no higher compliment she knew how to give. "I will never mock you again," he promised. "I will never mock anyone again without knowing their story first." Seo Yeon nodded once, accepting his promise the way she accepted everything, with quiet dignity and no expectation of anything more. 1 week later she returned to class, and when a new cadet asked Dren about the quiet human girl sitting alone at the back of the room, he simply looked at them with silver eyes that had seen things they could not imagine. "She is the reason we are alive," he said. "And if you are smart, you will never give her a reason to prove what she can do." The new cadet glanced back at Seo Yeon, who sat perfectly still with her dark eyes watching everything, saying nothing, carrying her silence like armor that had protected her through horrors and would protect her still. And somewhere deep in her memory, a child finally stopped crawling through the wreckage, finally stopped running from shadows, finally allowed herself to rest because she had found something worth protecting. And that was enough to make the silence feel less like hiding and more like peace.